Saluti a tutti, and welcome to this episode of Ciao DMV, Italian-American Life in the DMV. My name is Joseph Barone, and I will be your host. This podcast channel is dedicated to all things Italian and Italian-American in the DMV, aka DC, Maryland, and Virginia. My focus is on the Italian-American experience, from family stories to little-known history to businesses to cultural events, etc. Today, I bring you the first of a two-part interview with Anthony Cancelosi. Tony grew up in South Philly as a child of Southern Italian parents. However, even with that humble and simple beginning, he would wind up leading a number of worldwide, multi-million-dollar IT organizations. However, there is more to Tony than simply running companies. There is a lifelong commitment to giving back to others. Whether that is role-playing one of the most beloved characters in our culture, being part of a worldwide Catholic charitable association established over 1,000 years ago, to leading an organization which is dedicated to helping the blind remain independent, active, and productive in society. Tony has been a leader in business, but a leader and a doer in assisting others in need. However, before we begin the podcast, I do want to apologize to each of you, as you will hear a humming noise in the background. The room which we were in unfortunately had a piece of equipment that was running at all times. Again, please accept my apologies. With that, I bring you Anthony Cancelosi. Thank you very much, Tony, for taking the time to be with me today.
It is my pleasure, Joe. All the times I see you at the Lido Club, it's amazing that today we're getting together.
And this is one of the great things about this podcast is I've gotten to know really in depth about a number of Lido members. And so in a sense, it's kind of your turn. And I'm very glad and happy that you agreed to be on my podcast, and I'm so appreciative of it. So let me start with the most basic question that I ask everyone on my podcast, which is, where is your family from in Italy?
Well, my father was from Palermo, and his 6 brothers and sisters came over. And my father was born in 1910, so when they all came over here, they were little babies, some of them were not. My mother was from Sorrento. So now if you look at Palermo, Sorrento, you got to understand the different cultures between the Sicilians and the Napolitans and so forth. So I grew up in a very interesting, what I would call family. We only spoke Italian when I was younger, but I did not. My father's mother had passed away, so I had one grandmother, Filomena, and she was the love of my life.
Now, my background is I'm Sicilian. Both of my father and mother's side both come from Sicily, from the other side of the island. And Filomena, that's a name that you don't hear very much. It's an old name. I remember that.
Right.
We had a neighbor, Mrs. Filomena. You remember her maybe as a kid, but it's not a name we hear anymore today.
Well, you think about the names of children. My grandfather, my father's side, was Antonio. My mother's father was Antonio. And my grandmother that I never met was Sarah. And my grandmother, my mother's side, was Filomena. So, but when you grow up, you say, well, who are they going to name when all these kids start to come into the fold? Mm-hmm. And not unfortunately, but there were 2 Anthony Cancelosis. I mean, how do I deal with that? Mm-hmm. I did well, and I'm still remaining. The other ones are gone, and they died in their 90s. If you want to put that on your show, you can,
Okay.
Anyway.
So do you keep in touch with any of the relatives in Italy?
No, because the time has passed in age. They came over in the 1910s. But the interesting part about the Cancelosi family, and my mother's last name was Liro, is that the Cancelosi families came over through New Orleans. So if you look up today in New Orleans, there's quite a few Cancelosis. And Lero is more of a South Philadelphia name. And so my heritage comes about in a way that my grandmother, Philomena, took care of me when I was 5 and 6 years old. And my mother worked, my father worked. We lived on the same street with my grandmother and grandfather and my 2 aunts. So every day when my mother worked, my grandmother never came through the front door. She came through the back door. And when she came through, she was about 5 feet. And I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, close to her height. But she would come through the door and say, Antonio, come si bello, and touch my cheeks. And so I've never forgot that even today, that the love of a mother, but the love of a grandmother.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And my understanding is you grew up in Philly?
South Philadelphia.
South Philadelphia. What was life like growing up in South Philadelphia?
Well, we lived on Montrose Street, 10th and Montrose Street, a block away from the Italian market. So I lived in Italy. If anybody said to me, where did you grow up? I said, Italy. And they go, what? You grew up in Italy? Yes. The community we lived in, we spoke Italian. Mm-hmm. We act like Italians. We live like Italians. And my sister was 11 years older than me. So my mother would say to my sister, go down to the market. I want you to come back with a chicken. I want you to come back with this, come back with that, and take Antonio with you. And my sister used to take me. And guess what? I used to carry back the chicken that was still warm. That was the environment. And then going to school, St. Paul's Catholic Church, I went to Catholic school. And my name to fame was good and bad. I was designated to ring the bell at what I would call recess, right? And I was hated by most of my friends because I rang the bell and they had to come in. They go, hey. So growing up in that environment, but more importantly, growing up with our relatives that close, it kept my heritage in my heart all the time.
And what did your father do for a living?
Well, my father was an interesting man. Being born 11 years after my sister, my father started out, he was a police officer, motorcycle police officer, and then he was a professional fighter, which I did not know because coming 11 years later. And then when I did know my father, he and my uncles went into the fruit and produce business. So my father was a wholesaler in fruit and produce. And that adds to a story later, depending on when you ask some of the other questions. And so my father and I used to watch the Friday night fights when I was growing up. And he would score the fights. And I said, Dad, he knew who won and who didn't win. And so I eventually realized that I had a speed bag, sandbag in the basement that I needed to learn how to use because I got signed up for the Joe Louis Golden Gloves.
Wow.
But I never got into the ring to get that exercise, but I was trained to box. But my father, later in life, when I got married, my wife worked for the Marine Corps, and she was sitting at her desk, and a colonel, Marine, came in and said, oh, Cancelosi, I know Cancelosi. I know Frankie Day. My wife said, Frankie Day? Oh, yes, he was a middleweight boxer. Very good. My wife came home that night and said, did you know your father was a boxer? I said, well, yeah, a little bit, So at Sunday dinner, my wife says to my mother, Mom, is Dad a professional fighter? And my dad got up and my mother said, we don't talk about that. It was a wow in my life. I said, okay.
It's one of those things, we all have things in our family we don't talk about. Now, what about Mom? You said Mom worked. What did she do?
There was a group of Italian women. They were seamstress. my mom worked for a clothing manufacturer called Botany 500.
Yes.
And turned out, too, my father was a very good-looking man, and my mother was very beautiful. And my father used to model clothes for them. And so I'm finding all these things out as I'm getting older. And so she did that. She sewed, you ready? Seams. I said, Mom, what is a seam? Don't worry, Antonio.
And she did it all by hand? Or she
Oh, yeah. We're talking a long time ago, Joe.
So, thinking back to those times, mom, dad, grandmother watching you, your sister taking you to the market, and growing up at St. Paul's and ringing the bell and all the other things that evolved in life in those years. Is there a favorite memory that you have from those days?
Oh, my high school days?
Whatever.
Yeah, sure, because I went to South Philadelphia High School. And when I went, prior to that, it was an all-boys school. But when I went, we had girls. Girls. And so I decided, well, what am I going to do? I'm an athlete. I played football. And all of a sudden, I'm starting to realize I'm in school with Chubby Checker, who is a famous person, even today.
Yes.
What? The Twist.
Yes.
Chubby Checker was in my class.
Wow.
And so then I start realizing a guy named Fabian was in my class. I don't know if people remember Fabian, but Fabian was very famous. And then Bobby Rydell was in John Newman High School, went to school with my cousin. And I'm surrounded by these celebrities that were in high school, were 16 and 17 years old. And so the most memorable thing was that Fabian had a hit song, and he was appearing at the Steel Pier in Atlantic City, where they had the diving horse. And he invited us, hey, look, we're going to be singing afterwards. We're going to go on the boardwalk, and I'm going to have a party. You guys come with me. And I said, wow. So we all went down there. We had a great time. We were on the boardwalk, and I felt like a celebrity. I mean, hanging out with Fabian, come on, And so to think back of how famous they became and how we grew up together was an amazing part of my growing up.
This is amazing. Yes. I saw Chubby Checker a number of years ago in New York City at the South Street Seaport. One night they had a 50s week, and he was one of the performers and went to see it. And he could still, and now this was 35, this was 40 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I graduated in 1961.
He could belt it out. So here's the other question I always like to ask people. Thinking back to that time, what were two or three of the key lessons that you learned from that time that you still keep with you today?
I think the most important part was when my grandmother was coming into the house and saying, Antonio, come se bello. The love that we shared in our family growing up was the most encouraging thing today, that for years we always said we loved each other. And today more people are telling that they love each other. And I grew up with that love. I grew up with my grandparents, my aunts and uncles. We always said and hugged that we loved each other. And having that feeling of giving love to others was the most important thing that happened to me in my growth in family. But it carried forward with me in reference to how I was going to live my life after that.
Now, thinking back, you went to college.
Yes.
Got your degree, if I remember correctly, was it economics?
Well, I went to Pierce College to get my accounting degree.
Sorry.
And then was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to St. Joe's University, where I got my next degrees. And then I was fortunate enough to go on later to get executive programs at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania.
Very prestigious. Very prestigious. After college, am I correct in understanding, you can correct me, was your first job in the corporate world with Control Data?
Yes. Control Data was very large computer company, made major mainframes for years and years. And they started a service where they had these computer terminals that could scan across multiple locations and so forth. And I got involved in that and got to know it pretty well, to the point that we had huge contracts that I was involved in. And one of them, the big one, was with an organization called United Engineers. And at that time, nuclear plants were coming in, and we had the capacity to cable nuclear power plants with our technology. And that made me very successful at Control Data. For 20 years, I worked there and moved up very quickly and so forth and so on, and did very well financially.
And what were some of your positions with the company? Just curious.
With Control Data,
Yeah.
I was like salesperson, senior salesperson, then got into management. Then I got into managing centers. And then I came to Washington, D.C. to head up the government side. And the government side included Control Data had won the voting system for the House of Representatives. And I came to Washington to manage that. And so it was a great experience because I got to meet everybody on the Hill. Got the clearances. I worked on the Hill, got to know all the important people. One outstanding one was a guy named Nordy Hoffman, who was head of the U.S. Senate. And he was one of the 4 horsemen at Notre Dame. I got to know Nordy. And we got to know each other so that I would be able to go there and get a parking spot. This is when you could park. And he was an amazing man. Got to know Stan Kemet, who was head of this, and House of Representatives. I got to know, I put a congressional thing together. So the life working on the Hill then was tremendous in the interaction, and then with the White House and so forth.
At some point, you left Control Data and went to work for a number of other companies. And some of the ones that I have listed are something like eBright and eStar and Source Digital. And what were your roles in those? What were those companies? And what were your roles in some of them?
Well, Key Systems was the one that led into us finding and founding Sylvan Learning.
Okay.
And when I left Control Data in 1986, they had offered me the chief operating officer of Key Systems. And Key Systems was a very unique organization. The founders were very young. I was young. And they started out where we could do what we call training. Training was the key, because one of the jobs that I had at Control Data was these training centers we had all over the country using plasma terminals. So Key Systems, we started that out, and then all of a sudden we developed Sylvan Learning. And we developed all these training centers for kids to come and learn. And the essence of it was that we had a tool called a computer that attracted all these kids to come and learn. And our motto was, more we can show technology, more people will have coming to our centers. We were very successful. We went public, and I was very happy that we went public. I was one of the founders. And the best part was, what I learned was to be part of a company that went public. And that was an achievement that I felt, I'm part of a company that went public. And that made me really get to the next level of where I started to become CEO of a couple of the other companies, if you want to talk about those.
Sure. I'd love to hear about them. And thinking back, so I guess one of the big key takeaways for you from doing and working with Sylvan Learning was going public, and the whole process of going public in that. Any other key lesson that you had from Sylvan Learning? I mean, Sylvan Learning is still around. It's still a well-known name. I remember it very, very well years ago.
Yes.
Because I myself have been I was in the training business for almost 40 years, working first I was a school teacher and then went to New York City government to work for them, and then eventually here in DC for the World Bank. But other than that, did you have any other key lesson that came out of Sylvan Learning?
Well, the key lesson was we all invested. And when I left Control Data, I had a nice retirement package, and it was giving up money to invest in Key Systems, which became Sylvan Learning, and how we calculated how we were going to do this. Strategic thinking through strategic planning, business fundamentals, and having the backgrounds in school and learning from Wharton and St. Joe's and all, and having an accounting background, it helped me enormously to say, this is how we do it. This is our operating. Here's a balance sheet. Here's a P&L. All this stuff. You're starting to incorporate in your own mind strategic to run an organization. So what I learned was how to run an organization. More importantly is what we needed to do to go public, okay, and how we were going to do it. And if you really think hard about companies going public, it's not a snap.
Yes.
You've got to have what I would call the vision for people to see your vision and for your vision to become a reality. And Sylvan became a reality. And it's similar to a company, Astara, when I was asked to be the CEO of Astara. These were startups. Astara, we had one desk in an office in Reston, Virginia. And that was it. And now I had to raise money, but I knew how to raise money. I knew how to raise with investors and so forth. And Astara took off where we were single sign-on technology that we utilized for future organization. I mean, we're talking about technology that's 20-some years, 30-some years ago.
Yes.
But guess what? It worked. And that technology evolved into what we have today and a lot of the stuff that we're doing. And when you start to think about what makes a company successful, it's a combination of business fundamentals, but also common sense.
I want to switch gears for just a second. I'll go back to work, but I want to switch gears because my understanding is that you are an author.
Yes.
So tell our listeners about the book that you wrote and published, and because I think it's fascinating.
Sure. Well, let me ask you, do you believe in Santa Claus?
Oh, yes. I do believe in Santa Claus. Santa has been good to me over the years.
Well, if you're a believer, then I'll share the story. Years ago, I became president of an organization in Virginia, and they said, we need to have a holiday party, but we need to bring Santa Claus. And I said, okay, well, my friend Sid fit the part, and he said, I don't want it. You're the president, Tony. You become Santa. And I said, okay, I'll become Santa. I said, but I want a budget. And they gave me a budget, and I went out and picked the best Santa outfit I could, had custom boots made, belt, everything, because I knew kids always want to pull on your beard, pull up your boots. And I said, I'm not going to ever give away that I'm not real Santa. So I got all that. And my first gig was one of our annual meetings. But then I was on the board of an organization called ServiceSource. And at the board meeting one day, I became chairman of the board of ServiceSource. And one of the board members was senior guy at Marriott Corporation. And he said, you know, Tony, you're Santa. Would you be Santa at our annual Christmas parties? And I said, sure. So the essence of it, I did children and I did parties and so forth. And I did for almost 20 years of family. And there's a little story to that one I'll tell you later. And so Marriott said, okay, what do you want? I said, well, I want this and want that and that. I said, I want to be real. So the first party was held at the Ritz in Virginia. And I get there in a red truck. And standing outside were these young girls dressed as elves. And they paraded me into the Marriott, and I was Santa. They had all the lights and everybody loved it. And then they kept asking me to come back again and again. And I did Santa for a long time. And then for Santa alone, it always had to be, do you really believe? And the reality for me was that about 7 or 8 years ago, a young lady that I was Santa to graduated from college, and her father, or actually her grandfather, called me and said, Tony, do you have an internship for so-and-so? And I said, sure. She came to my office, and I'm CEO, and she was sitting out here. She never came into my office. The day she came into my office, and I was speaking to her, and she said, Santa, is that you? And she recognized my voice after 20 years. And we were at a hockey game with my wife and I. We have tickets to the Caps, and and my best friend was with his grandson, and we stopped to say hello. And his grandson says to me, and looks right at me, said, "Santa?" And he was one of those kids 20 years ago.
Wow.
So that makes me feel really honored. And so the book was created of all the different things I did as Santa.
Mm-hmm.
I dedicated to my granddaughter, who was just born, and it's called Santa's Secret. It's also in the Library of Congress, but at the time worked with the Columbia Lighthouse. So I have it in Braille at the Library of Congress, in Spanish, English, large print, and I'm working on Italian, believe it or not. And so it's online everywhere. You can buy it anywhere. The best part, I never have to worry. Every year it's a seasonal book.
Okay.
I don't have to keep rewriting it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to look for it online and purchase one. I wonder if I purchase one, would you be willing to autograph it for me?
Well, let me say, after this interview, I will give you a signed copy. You won't have to purchase.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. And that'll be great because, I'm a grandfather now. Just became a grandfather.
Yeah, right.
So that would be a wonderful thing for me to
You'll have one. You will have one.
And all of the future grandchildren. Yeah. So let's get back to work.
Sure.
Business. About 20 or so years ago, you joined the Columbia Lighthouse for the Blind as president and CEO.
Sure.
How did that come about?
Well, let's step back before that. And when I left Sylvan Learning and all, I went to work for ICL, International Computers Limited, which was in England. So for 10 years, I worked in England.
Wow. And
I ran the worldwide software company here in the U.S. and in England. And that gave me an opportunity to do international work for 10 years. And it started with a dear friend of mine was running it, and he wasn't well, but I was the only American executive. I was president worldwide. That gave me an opportunity to work in 65 different countries, which I never went to every one of them. But we created worldwide software, and we sold it eventually as a company. And ICL was the second largest computer manufacturer in England. So I didn't want this interview not to go to let you know that was the essence of accomplishment that I think most people want to do in their life, is to do international work. So for 10 years, I traveled back and forth to England and developed a lot of friendships, and I ran a very large organization for 10 years.
So based on that, let me ask you two questions before we go on to Columbia Lighthouse. Number one, what type of software did ICL develop? Was it more business to business? What was it?
It was high-end security. What had happened, ICL, being a very significant computer manufacturer, was developing a lot of software for the MOD, which is our DoD. And that became available for integration to all networks. So we secured stuff where at that time there were major break-ins to computers. And one of them was a major car manufacturer that was in another country. And I went to visit with them. People were breaking in and stealing designs of cars. Then there were people breaking into the banks and stealing money. We developed to secure those networks because if you ever want to talk about AI, and what I did 20 some years ago, 30 years ago, was that we had real integrated software to protect the assets of those organizations. So it was a 3 or 4 billion pound company for years. So, and then it sold itself off.
What was life like for you in the UK?
Well, it wasn't just the UK. It was Sweden and Singapore, Australia. It was all these countries that we were in, more than 50 countries. That was another experience. If you think about what you want to find in your life of going public, but now managing a worldwide thing that's international, it gave me a perspective of what the Germans think, what the Italians think, what the English. There's no unified Europe in that sense. But what the common thing that we had, we built a channel. we did a lottery. We built the lottery for the when I was there. We built the lottery.
Wow.
Yeah. And we were all nervous the night the Queen was going to pick the first. And if she won, we would all get blown away. But it was that experience that, again, when people ask you, well, how did you get to be a CEO, or how did you get here? There's an evolution of that in where people perceive who you are,
Right.
but more importantly is how you see yourself helping others.
So let's get to Columbia Lighthouse.
Sure. Okay. All right. There's an article that was written by an organization called NIAF. And I was Humanitarian of the Year award there. And when they were interviewing me, they wanted to interview about how did I come to the Columbia Lighthouse. Well, my father had lung cancer and he was not doing well. And then right before he passed away, he went blind. And so that stayed with me for a long time. And then when I finished my thing in England and so forth, I used to be on the international board for people with disabilities. ICL was helping people, veterans coming back. And that's why I was with ServiceSource. We did with that when I was on the international board for people with disabilities. And somebody said to me, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'm on the board, chairman of the board of ServiceSource. And we had just won a major contract to do all of the mail rooms for the IRS. And they asked me as chairman of the board to speak about the contract and so forth. And the Columbia Lighthouse was there. And when I gave my talk and so forth, somebody said to me, well, are you working? And I said, yeah, I'm always working. And I said, well, would you be interested in interviewing at the Columbia Lighthouse to be their CEO? And I said, okay. And so I went for the interview. It was a very tough interview. And the person that was doing the search, Paul Rothenberg, said to me, he said, you want this job? I said, yeah, I want the job. He said, then you better be sharp as a tack because you're going to get entered. And they were. They asked me all kinds of stuff. More importantly is, why would you want this job? You've been successful in all the other things you're doing. Where's your heart? And what will you do for us that we're not doing now? The one thing that they were trying to do 20 years ago or more was to win government contracts. And I knew that. I knew we did that at Control Data. We knew how to do it. And I had all the contacts on the Hill and so forth. And so I interviewed. It was very tough. And then when they finally said, well, you're going to be our CEO, and they gave me 2 pages of things they wanted me to fix. And I said, okay. And the experience was that we took people that were visually impaired, gave them the opportunity to be independent, but more importantly, develop their self-worth of what they could do in contributing to others. And we put them into these jobs. And the contracts that we were winning, we won a very large contract with the Army National Guard. And it's been running now. It's going to go into its 6th year, go into 10 years of employing more than 42 people that are visually impaired and earning an income, being independent. We created independence as our vision to give people that opportunity because you don't have sight. It doesn't mean you can't contribute at the level of everybody else.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of my interview with Anthony Cancelosi. If you're interested in being on this podcast, please feel free to contact me at ciaodmv@gmail.com. That is ciaodmv@gmail.com. And please remember, if you enjoyed listening to this episode, please take a moment to like, comment, subscribe, and or share with a friend. This is Joseph Barone, your host, signing out. Ciao for now.